In this video, I'll show you how we made this curved wall for our vintage camper trailer bathroom. In case you're new here, my name is Dan and I love to DIY things. And for the past 2 years, my mom and I have been renovating this 1949 Spartan Manor camper trailer, and we're really happy with how it's going. Making this wall curved was a lot of work, but it was really satisfying, and we think it adds a lot of character to the interior of this trailer because it also matches how curvy the outside is. And eventually we're gonna have some bench seating wrapping around this part of the trailer. And so if you were to be sitting back here, having that curved wall makes it feel a lot more open. Whereas had it been a regular corner, you can see how much further it would have stuck out. And for the most part, it looks pretty smooth, but you can definitely feel the steps in the curve. So we want to make the wall curve along this radius, which you can see is just about 12 inches. And since the plywood is 3/4 of an inch, let's just call it 13 inches to the outside radius. There's a great website called blocklayer.com that has a kerf spacing calculator for bending wood. And if you input a 13-inch outer curve radius with a 90-degree curve sweep angle and a kerf width, that's the width of your saw blade, of 0.1 and a wood thickness of 3/4 of an inch, it gives you all the spacings for the cut to achieve that curve. And just to define it, a kerf is a notch, channel, or slit cut into a piece of material using a tool like a saw. So kind of like this. So before we do this on the full wall, we'll try this on a scrap piece of plywood. So on your table saw, you'll have to adjust the blade height until it goes almost all the way through the wood. Here, I'm trying to leave that last inner layer intact, and you can see that cut depth here, but a quick test shows that it's not very flexible at all. So I adjusted the blade height so it cut halfway through that last inner layer, and now we're getting some movement. That does it. Then I simply followed the measurements given on the kerf calculator website until I cut about 10 kerfs into this scrap piece of wood. And a quick test shows that it looks really promising. And up in the trailer, it looks like it's going to match the curve perfectly. So before we cut a ton of kerfs into a long piece of plywood, we're measuring the maximum length and cutting it down to that size. So even though I used the table saw to do that test curve, I realized I wasn't going to be able to maneuver that large piece of plywood on here by myself, so I ended up using a circular saw. And I'm really glad I did, because the blade on here is quite a bit thinner than the blade on there. Hopefully you can see here that the thickness of the circular saw blade is about half the thickness of the table saw blade. So if we go back to our kerf calculator and reduce the kerf width, we'll see that we need to make a lot more cuts, but it should result in a smoother curve. And following the measurements from the website, I marked out the location of each kerf on either end of the plywood, and then traced out each kerf. And you can see there are a lot of them. We put the plywood on sawhorses to make it easier to reach, and then adjusted the cut depth of the circular saw based on what we learned on the test piece. It's about 1.5 inches from this edge to the blade, and this piece of wood is 1.5 inches. So I'm going to set up this guide with this 1.5 inch piece, and I'll clamp it down, and then when I take this away, that should guide the saw right down that line. I'm a bit nervous making this first cut, so I check to make sure it's going to the right depth, and then keep on going with the cut. As you can see, this step is super dusty, so I really recommend wearing a face mask, and we even set up a fan with an air filter on it to help pull some of that dust out of the air. So not quite halfway through this layer, which I was on the test piece, so I might have to go just a little bit deeper. So I adjusted the blade down a little bit and went over that same kerf to make it the right depth. From that point, it was just a repetitive process of undoing the clamps, resetting the guide and then the spacer, clamping the guide again, and making the cut. In total, there were nearly 20 kerfs to cut. And it's all going really smoothly until... So just be careful going along, especially in the middle, because it can bow. That's when that's popped underneath and gone astray. So make sure to press down firmly on the guide, especially when you're between the sawhorses, so that the circular saw doesn't slip underneath it, and so that you stay on track. There's the last of the 19 cuts, and I swept up the bulk of the sawdust, and then turned it upside down to get it out of the kerfs. And here's a quick test of its flexibility. We want to have a form to bend this plywood around so that when we're gluing it, it can really hold the proper shape. And to do that, I made a makeshift compass with a scrap of wood with one hole the size of a pen tip on one end. This sticks out just enough. and another hole to let a screw pass as the pivot point. With the screw secured, I was able to trace an arc of 12¼ inches, which is the inner radius of our curved wall, and then cut it out with the jigsaw. And this doesn't have to be perfect because after all, we're bending a really big piece of wood around it. And here we can see our test piece bends around it really nicely, as does our wall panel. Perfect. And then I traced it to make 3 more copies. To join these quarter circles into a form that would be about the height of the wall, I ripped down some scraps of OSB into approximately 2-inch wide strips. Then at the miter saw, I cut off any bad ends, and then used a block I'd set up as a stop so that I could cut a bunch of pieces the exact same length, which is about 2 feet long. Then I used one of those pieces to figure out where exactly they would attach to the quarter circles. Then drilled through holes for the screws to pass through the quarter circles and into the OSB planks. Using clamps, I used that first quarter circle as a template to drill holes in the rest. And to make attaching the OSB planks to either side of these quarter circles easier, we're staggering the next set off by just a little bit so that we don't have to put screws in at weird angles. This might make more sense when you see me putting it together. And keep in mind that not all of them need all these holes. The ones on either end will only need one set of these holes. To assemble these, I used some 2-inch cabinet screws and began attaching the OSB pieces one by one. So when we curve this wall around this form, I don't want that wall touching any of these OSB pieces. It's only going to be in contact with these quarter circle curves. Here on the second segment, I use a long piece of straight plywood to make sure that the third quarter circle lines up with the other two. You can see how these OSB planks are offset from the ones on the first segment. And this makes it so much easier to secure them with the screws. This is a pretty straightforward process and actually pretty satisfying to see this take shape, but it does take a little while. Of course, I had to offset these so we could put screws in from both sides. Same for down here. All right, here's our frame to bend the plywood around. To reduce the risk of this plywood cracking, I'm wetting it down with some water and a sponge. And hot water would probably be best, but I'm just using room temperature. And to make sure that this plywood doesn't get glued to the form, I'm covering those curves with some regular packing tape, although that silver tape used for duct repair is a lot better. Now I've flipped the plywood with the Kerfs up and put the mold on top of that with the curve down, and I'm putting these tie-down straps around it to start bending the plywood around the form. And with those two, it's only getting it started, but you can see when I place a ratchet strap on this end, it really makes the plywood hug the form. So it looks like this is going to work. Before I start applying the glue, I wet down the flat surface of the plywood yet again, and then flip it over. This is the type of wood glue I'm using to try and fill each of these kerfs, and wow, this was really tedious and took a long time. And I ran out of that type of glue and then had to use another type, but I'm not really worried about that. And here as I'm bending the plywood, I'm checking to see how much glue is coming out of the cracks, because I would like to see a little squeeze out, which would mean that that kerf is well filled with glue. So with all the glue applied, I'm putting the form into position, and I start bending the plywood using these tie-down straps. And maybe because of the nature of the curve, it seems like it centers the form really naturally. And with each ratchet strap, I'm aiming to put one at the location of each of those quarter circles. And here you can see I'm just trying to make sure that the edge of the form is in line with the plywood. And you do have to be pretty mindful of how you're positioning the ratchet strap, because the ratcheting mechanism, of course, you don't want on the plywood, and you don't want those hooks on there either. As you can see, I have both of those resting against the form and not the plywood. Here I'm just ensuring that the webbing in the ratchet strap isn't twisted, and I tighten it down until that curve is hugging the form really nicely. And here you can see I have one ratchet strap at the location of each quarter circle of the form, and that holds it really well. And just a quick close-up of how well that plywood is bending around the form. There is some glue leaking out of some of the kerfs, but not as much as I expected, so I'm a little bit worried about that. And worried in the sense that I'm afraid this might not hold its curve once I let it out of the mold. Nonetheless, I'm wiping up the excess glue with the damp sponge, because otherwise that'll be really hard to clean up later.
We'll leave this all kind of clamped in place for a few hours and come back to it later and see how it's holding on the curve. Look at how good this side's looking. I'm really glad I ended up going with the circular saw with the thinner bit, because that meant more cuts, and as you can see, it looks a lot smoother than the one with the table saw did. Now it looks like a big log. And definitely leave it curved side down with the glue going into the cracks, because when I turned it over, some started leaking out. It's the next day and I'm gonna undo these ratchet straps. I'm really curious to see how this holds.
This was a pretty exciting moment, removing the ratchet straps.
Oh, so far so good. All right, I'm really impressed with how well this is holding. It really hasn't relaxed much from that shape at all. That's still really flush. There, there, there. I think it worked.
And thanks to the tape on the mold, I was able to lift this right off of the plywood.
Just a few areas to clean up that were under the tape. That's even still wet from being under the tape.
And flipping it over, I'm just taking a moment to admire that this actually came out. And it's not super apparent visually, but if you do rub your hand across the wood like this, you can feel distinct ridges where each kerf is and where the plywood bends. Overall, we were really happy with how this curved wall came out. This is the first time we had ever bent plywood like this, and we think it makes a really nice addition to the inside of the trailer. From this angle and this lighting, you can definitely see some of those steps in the curve. And of course, the inside, you can see all the kerfs. And in the next video, we'll show you how we installed that and all the other walls for this bathroom. So if you like videos like this, you might like this one here.